recently we did a video talking about the scutum, the large Roman shield with a gladius used against pike blocks or phalanxes as used by the Macedonians. And of course pike blocks have been used throughout history by numerous different cultures and civilizations, all the way into the age of gunpowder, of course used in conjunction with musketeers and artillery when there was a revival of the use of the pike in the Renaissance. But one of the great questions of history is, how do large shields interact with pikes? Now, in my previous video, many people correctly pointed out we were looking at one shield versus one pike. So why don't we look at it with a few more people? So now we have a group of pikemen and also a few shields, and we're going to see how they work against each other. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we're going to be looking today at the interaction between large shields and pikes. Now, I don't want you to think that this is specifically necessarily looking at Romans versus Macedonians, but obviously they're two groups of people who famously use large shields and also pikes. But of course pikes have a much longer history, and indeed so do shields. So today we're going to be looking at a group of pikes and at least a couple, maybe three, shields, and how those two things interact with each other. And this is really partially to answer the question that many people raised under my previous video, saying, okay, one shield versus one pike, we can see how that would work, but what about if there are multiple pikes? To which my simple answer is, what if there are multiple shields as well? So I think if we're going to increase the number of pikes, we also have to increase the number of shields. Right, so I've just stepped outside the class for a minute because I know it is noisy in there. We're going to look at some action in a second, but first of all, a little bit of explanation and talking. So quite simply, as I mentioned, we looked before, when I was doing it with Lucy in the garden, we looked at one large shield versus one pike. And in a very simplistic manner, we were really showing how the problem is that the shield shuts down the potential lines of attack of the pike. And the pike is, after that point, kind of limited to trying attacking over or under the shield. And it's really important, and we'll see this in a minute, that one of the problems with pikes being very long spears, or at least long spears in this case, you don't have an awful amount of angulation. So general rule is the longer a weapon gets, the less of an angle you've got to get around things, which makes it really difficult to get around the shield, especially the Roman scutum as it happens, because the Roman scutum is curved. So it goes around your body and you can get in down behind it, which means it's very difficult for a pike to come around the sides. As I say, it can really only go over or under. So what we want to see is, how does that work? What do the pikes do against those types of shields? But I do want to caveat all of this with one simple statement, that is, we're not necessarily looking at recreating Roman tactics here, because there are many different theories about how they cycled troops kind of into the front line, but equally, how close did they stand? There's a lot of conjecture and debate around that. And moreover, if we take, for example, the Macedonian phalanx, there's a lot of debate over how exactly that was organised and how they held their pikes and how they functioned as well. So we're not necessarily asserting that this is a recreation of Romans and Macedonians. We're just looking more generally at how large shields potentially can interact with long spears or pikes. So something very important to say is that the people from the club here, this is the Woking Club, if you ever want to come down to our Surrey Club and Persevere, you're very welcome to. They are not expert pike people, okay? It's as simple as that. So we're gonna, first of all, look at how should they stand when opposed to people with shields. So if you just form up with your pikes forward in whatever manner you see best at the moment. Right, good. So as I said, one of the things that came up in the previous video is, what if there are multiple pike people? And the point I made about the Roman scutum is you're really able to get most of your body down behind it. You can hide behind it. And the problem with the pike is, being a long weapon, it only has a certain number of angles it can actually poke from. Now here we've only got one rank. We will look at multiple ranks in a minute. But quite simply, if you get in down behind here, they don't have an awful lot of places that they can poke you, but they can push you back, okay? So the pikes actually have a pushing effect. These are obviously blunt, they don't have points on, but bear in mind that pointy ones might get embedded in the actual shield and bind with it, although those actually bind quite well because they're flat on the end. So they can push you away, but they can't quite get to you very easily. Now bear in mind, if I'm a Roman in this situation, I will have a helmet, I'll have some form of lorica, either mail, hamata, or segmentata plate armour. And if I've got myself fully down behind here, even if a little bit of my head is poking over the top, maybe I can brace my shield with my sword like that, and I'm attempting to get into them. So they can push me away, but they can't necessarily poke me very easily, unless they spread out. So if you spread out further into a longer line, so don't go too far up there, so if you move along here, Alex, there we go, move along there. Now, they've got angulation on me. So if I start to come in at this point, and be careful because I'm not wearing any protective gear. So if I start to come in here at the center, the problem is these people over here and those people over there can now get around my shield. So absolutely, if it's one shield person versus in this case 7 pikemen, you're probably not going to do very well with just as a single swordsman with a shield. But even in that situation, they still have to get around the shield. And as you will see there, it's still not as simple as you might think, because you're essentially inside the scutum. Now, as I mentioned previously, we were in only one rank. Now we've gone into 2 ranks, so we've got 4 in the front, 3 behind. And you'll notice this has 2 major advantages. Number 1, it means that the front rank are reaching furthest forward with their pikes, but if I close in and get beyond those pikes somehow, I'm now in the range of the second line, of the second rank of pikes. But moreover, they can come from 2 different angles. The pikes at the front can be coming from below or in the low line, and the pikes behind can be coming high and over the top, which means that if I try and cover the pikes behind in the high line, I might get stabbed low by the front pikes, or vice versa. If I parry the low ones, then I'm now potentially exposed over the top to the second rank of pikes. Right here we're trying yet another formation, and I would loosely call this a wedge. So now we've got Lewis here is at the front, at the spearhead of the wedge. Then we've got essentially a second rank behind there in a triangle formation, and a third rank behind that. Now, potentially this adds to what we looked at before, because we can have multiple different angles of the pikes pointing at me, but moreover, they can be at multiple different heights vertically as well. So we've got different angles in terms of the sort of horizontally where they are, but also vertically where they are as well, which complicates it further. But of course, at this point, I am just one shield person, and it's not fair to really pit one me against 7 of them. Ideally, we really need 7 people with shields versus 7 people with pikes. And this is one of the points that I think a lot of people missed in the previous video. We were looking at 1 versus 1, and people went, there should be more pikemen. To which I repeat, my answer would be, there should be more shieldmen as well. And if we make equal numbers, it would obviously change the dynamic a lot. But sadly for you, today, maybe this will be a future video, we only have 2, possibly 3 shields versus 7 pikes. So let's see what happens anyway. And one really important point I want to make as well is that yes, I know the Macedonian phalanx, they usually had shields and pikes, but for simplicity's sake in this video, we're only going to look at pikes. Okay, maybe in a future video we'll have the pike people also with shields, but for now we're just looking at large shield versus pike. There you go. So for the purposes of this experiment now, the pikes have been told to stay where they are, as if they're part of a larger formation. And equally, the shields have been told that they're part of a larger group as well. So they can't skirmish around the sides, they are committed to a frontal assault. So we've had some really interesting results there, but an important thing to point out is there are 7 pikes and only 2 shields. So we're going to add in another shield person. So one of the things that's really important with this kind of simulation is for the perimeter to be really strictly defined, because we're assuming that these troops, whether it's the pikes or the shields, are part of a bigger formation. If we allow them to run around and flank each other, it's a completely different type of thing. That's skirmishing, which is not what we're really looking at here. We're looking at battle lines, parts of larger formations, and we're just taking a little snapshot section for scientific analysis of that bigger formation. So I've been chatting with the team, and there are some really interesting observations already. One of those things is regarding the vertical openings and exposed bits, heads and legs. What did you guys notice? So Stephen, you mentioned
my feet were massively exposed. I got stabbed in the feet quite a few times whilst protecting my head. Yeah,
so this is something, so obviously the Roman scutum is about as long as most shields get. You could say the Norman teardrop shield as well is pretty long. But the problem is that if you raise it up to cover your head, your face, then obviously you expose the legs. Now the legs aren't necessarily an easy target, but if you get stabbed in the legs or the feet, it's clearly going to potentially injure you and could stop you from advancing. Helena, you mentioned something as well about heads, I think.
Yeah, we paired up in our group and said alternating sort of, one of us will go for the head and one of us will go for the feet, and because they were moving the shield, that exposed, which was when we got people.
I love that. I love that. Okay, so that's really nice and tactical, because of course you've got a bunch of people with pikes, so you can some specifically target the head, some specifically target the legs, and therefore the shield people are going to be kind of playing catch up, not knowing which thing to cover. One thing I would say about the heads though is if we were looking at a kind of Roman context, or indeed most periods of history, they're going to be helmets. So I think in this particular game we're classing a hit to the head as a hit to the head, as if they were unarmoured, but obviously on a battlefield most soldiers are wearing some form of headgear, and particularly with the Roman culus helmet, if you duck it down behind the shield, as I mentioned in my previous video, there's a good chance that things will slide off your helmet. You know, the helmet's there for a reason. So something else that is an interesting observation that came up is Alex here, who you might recognise, and he noticed something interesting about the nature of people thrusting with spears or pikes. Do you want to explain?
Yeah. So I noticed as a shield bearer, if I was advancing, a couple of times I put my shield out a little bit ahead of me, kind of baited them into stabbing at it, and if 2 or 3 people went for it at the same time, there's a little bit of a recharge time because they've got to pull their pikes back to thrust again. So as soon as I felt that initial contact and the blow on the shield, I then basically charged in with them pulling their pikes back, which then meant I was much closer and then had the momentum to get in and start stabbing before they could stab again.
It's almost kind of like a ripple or waves, isn't it? And if the thrusts come all at the same time and then they start to recharge those thrusts, that's when you push in. I wonder if more experienced pikemen would essentially learn to almost have a rhythm whereby they almost take turns at stabbing rather than all stabbing at the same time. Yeah. It's an interesting thing that I'd never thought about before. So Darren noticed a really interesting thing about leverage.
The gladius could quite easily push the point offline, quite noticeably so, and then make those openings that the other guys were suggesting.
Yeah, and this is one of the weaknesses of pikes. The longer the pike gets, the weaker at the tip it gets. It's a longer lever, so it's easier to manipulate.
It's quite surprising, just literally smack it out of the way with quite a light blow.
You know, with your
blow,
sword.
You could push it out the way and then just charge in.
Charge in as quickly as possible when an opening is created. Now, obviously, if there are more pikes there filling the gap, that complicates things to some extent.
I also think our pikemen are being particularly nice to us as well.
They're kind pikemen, which isn't always what you want. But maybe let's do a bit more and let's see what else we observe. Ready when you are! pikes, you can attack if you want. You can move forwards. Macedonians often did. So it seems that the pikemen are learning and the swordsmen were all taken out quite quickly then. What they seem to be doing is combining the angles of attack. So the pikes, some of the pikes are stabbing from above, some of the pikes are stabbing low. This makes it particularly difficult for the shields to deal with. You are. Okay, ready when you are. So I hope you enjoyed that. We're now going to have a bit of post-match analysis. I personally found it really interesting how both sides evolved tactics. You know, we haven't been doing this for a long time. We're new to this. Obviously, many of us have done a lot of sparring singularly with spears or pikes or obviously shields and swords and things like that. But we haven't kind of looked at this particular question and tried to test out some different theories. And I thought it was very interesting how I think, we'll see in a second what the others think, but I think that the shields worked best when they closed quickly, because that reduced the amount of time that the pikes had to stab multiple times and try and find openings. If you could reduce the time that you were being poked at, that was generally speaking a good thing for the shields. And obviously once they get close, the short sword is at an advantage over the pikemen because it can operate in close distance. But equally I noticed that the pikes evolved a system whereby they had some people putting the pikes low and some people high. But let's see what the other people say. So Alex has opinions.
Right, so as a second line pikeman, I actually found that although going over the top was sometimes useful, it was actually better for me to stay low and further back, keep a shorter pike, because then when someone broke through the front rank, I could then pinpoint strike them while they were occupied with the first rank of pikes. Whereas if I had up and over almost the same length, there was maybe half a step between when they broke through and when they got to me, and that usually wasn't enough time for me to react to put a point strike onto an exposed area.
Very interesting. So very much I think what we're starting to see is not all pikes are fulfilling the same role. Within a pike block you'll have different pikes doing different things, whether it's at different heights or to counter different kind of attacks that might be coming in at the pike block. Valerie also has views.
So I was in the shield, and when we started off with me in the middle, because I was so short, I found that I got stabbed really quickly, and it meant that we weren't going through quite as quickly.
Yeah.
And when I swapped with Stephen, having the taller one in the front and then me at the back shorter, it meant that I could come in and cover a bit more with my head.
So you hid behind Stephen?
Basically, yes. But I think it's also height plays a part in it, because of trying to keep the shields at the right height to try and prevent tall people from getting over. And I think having awareness of your body in a shield wall is really important, keeping the shield up where the shield is, trying to protect our feet. And with us being the way we were, we could move the shield up and down. However, we let gaps. So if we stay closer together in our wedge, I think we could have prevented more stabbing.
Yeah, and I think building on that as well, I'd say that obviously the relative size of the human compared to the shield plays a part here. If you can get more of yourself behind the shield, that seems to be an advantage, and I personally think that's what the Romans were doing with their shield design.
Yeah, we weren't staying tied together. I think the problem was as we were going in, even though we went in together, we started to split. So it's the classic fighting us together, and it's like, this person's over here, this person's over here, and you kind of get distracted. Where I think we should have almost locked together a bit more, and I think that would have allowed us to have been more of a team, which is what the pike were doing, because you had the different heights. And also being 3 of us versus 7. Did play a part in it.
But and that's a really important point to make here. This was 3 people with shields, at one point 2 people with shields, versus 7 pikes. So there's a big disparity here. And I think one of the points that I would again make to the people in the comments under my previous video is we mustn't only talk about multiple pikes, but we have to talk about multiple shields. And of course, one of the other things we were trying to simulate here is we weren't flanking, because we were assuming that both the pikes and the shields had other soldiers to the left and right of them, so they couldn't move around the sides. It's very clear from various battles, like the Battle of Flodden and various battles with the Macedonians, that pike blocks were vulnerable on the flanks. They are vulnerable to flank attacks. So I hope that's been fun to watch and given you some food for thought. Please bear in mind that we are specialists of medieval, Renaissance and later periods of fencing one-on-one, and while many of us, me for example, do reenactment and group battles in that sense, and we do melee games, we do some skirmishing, this type of coordinated pike block against coordinated shield wall or testudo, whatever you want to call it, is fairly new to us. So this is experimental stage, and there are lots of things we haven't looked at here, and there are lots of parameters we can test in the future. And on that note, if there are certain things you would like us to try, certain scenarios, objective-based sparring or weapon combinations in this type of test, then let us know down in the comments. And thanks to all of the students at Schola Gladiatoria who've helped make this video possible. We will return. I have been Matt Easton, I'll of course continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon for another video. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.